The oppressive humidity of the Mississippi summer of 1871 had not broken. It merely thickened into a malarial mist that clung to the low-lying farmland, wrapping the isolated homestead in a shroud of suffocating silence. It was the kind of silence that did not signify peace, but rather the suspended breath of a massive, hungry predator, waiting for the optimal moment to strike. This evening, the silence was perforated only by the frantic chirping of unseen insects and the low, rhythmic sawing sound of the crickets, a mechanical chorus that only served to underscore the unnatural absence of any human noise. Isaiah knew the sound of quiet. He had lived with it, learned it, mapped its texture across the decades he had spent under the lash, and then, briefly, under the fleeting promise of freedom. But this quiet, this utter debilitating vacuum that swallowed the sounds of the wind, rustling the brittle corn stalks, and even the distant, familiar croak of the swamp bullfrogs, was different. It tasted of sulfur and iron, the metallic tang of imminent bloodshed carried on the stagnant, heavy air. He stood perfectly still by the single rough-hewn window of the main cabin, his large, calloused hand resting lightly on the cold iron of a newly acquired Spencer repeater. The glass pane, imperfectly manufactured and rippling like water, offered a distorted view of the scrubland that gave way to the dense, pine-choked woods surrounding his modest spread. His wife, Clara, was behind him, equally still, hovering near the stone hearth, the only source of light filtering weakly into the room. Their young daughter, Mercy, was tucked away beneath a thick quilt in the adjoining room, blissfully unaware of the creeping, absolute darkness that had begun to solidify beyond the door. The ranch, a defiant patch of tilled earth and self-sufficiency carved out of the hostile post-Reconstruction landscape, was Isaiah's only world, the fragile evidence of his hard-won autonomy. For 5 years they had existed here, invisible to the larger world, hoping the sheer exhaustion of the land itself would deter the ghosts of the Confederacy. They had almost succeeded in believing the nightmares were over. The first indication that the quiet was shattered came not from a sound but from a smell. Wood smoke, heavy and acrid, but laced unmistakably with lamp oil and the sickening odor of wet, cheap muslin. It was a smell that meant assembly, purpose, and malice. Then the lights. They did not appear abruptly, but rather seeped into existence, slow flares of sickly yellow and orange, igniting the edges of the dark timberline. These were not the lights of honest men returning home or neighbors passing by. These were torches, held high and steady by hands that intended to burn, not illuminate. They were lanterns of judgment, marking the periphery of the Holland farmstead with malignant intent. Isaiah counted them instinctively, the way a man who has worn chains counts the links, not to determine number but durability. The flicker danced, multiplying, revealing the shapes holding them. Tall, unnatural shapes, draped in the iconic, abominable sheets of bleached cotton. Hooded figures, dissolving the individuality of men and synthesizing them into a single, collective entity of vengeance and hate. The numbers were staggering. 50, 60. Then they spilled out from the deeper shadows, emerging from the pines like pale, silent maggots, crawling from the carcass of the Old South. They kept coming, an unrelenting stream of spectral white forms against the absolute blackness of the night. By the time the final torch flared to life deep in the eastern field, Isaiah had a horrifying, sickening tally. 100. 100 hooded specters surrounding his small island of existence, encompassing every possible avenue of escape, every blind spot, every patch of cover. 100 robes, armed with the lawless authority of absolute terror. This was the siege. It wasn't merely a threat. It was an execution scheduled to begin at the clan's convenience. The chilling question that clawed at the back of Isaiah's throat, the open loop that tightened the tension like a garrote wire, was why now? Why here? They were poor, isolated, and largely ignored. They posed no threat to the local power structure, having deliberately kept their heads down. The answer, he knew, lay in the insidious nature of fear and the memory of mastery. Isaiah had not always been Isaiah Holland, free farmer. Before 1865, he had been known simply as the Hand on the enormous and brutal Caldwell plantation, 70 miles west. He was called this not because he was physically strong, but because his hands were preternaturally steady, his eyes impossibly keen. He had been acquired by the plantation owner, Colonel Caldwell, not for field work, but for the dark, lucrative sport of hunting runaway slaves in the dense bayou country. He was, by the gruesome nature of his bondage, a weapon. He was the plantation's sharpshooter. During the war, Caldwell, desperate to save his own hide and property, had lent Isaiah's lethal skills to the Confederate effort, using him as a detached, necessary evil to pick off Union scouts. Isaiah had done his grim duty, surviving by the cold calculation that survival meant obedience, and obedience meant temporary utility. He had learned the lethal geometry of trajectories, the way wind played a lie across a mile, and the precise psychological moment to squeeze a trigger and achieve maximum demoralization. He had killed men for his freedom, both those who sought to deny it to others and those cruelly who sought it for themselves. When emancipation came, the war-era rifle Caldwell had entrusted him with never found its way back to the colonel's study. It remained with Isaiah, a constant dark reminder of the blood he had spilled and the skill that had kept him alive. He had bought this land and melted into the obscurity of Reconstruction, hoping his past was buried deeper than the roots of the southern pines. But the Deep South was a place where nothing truly died. The memories, the resentment, and the scorekeeping were merely suspended, waiting for the cover of darkness to resurrect them. Tonight, those memories had returned, draped in white linen and howling for reckoning. The 100 men outside, they were not here for theft or petty revenge. They were the vengeful specters of the old order, determined to cleanse the South of its newly formed, imperfect freedoms. They had likely learned of his identity through some drunken boast, some whispered tavern tale, realizing they weren't just surrounding a Negro farmer, but a living, breathing paradox, a black man with a warrior's skill set who dared to own land and refuse submission. This was an affront to their very conception of racial hierarchy, a crime punishable only by obliteration. The tension outside was not characterized by shouting or aggressive movement, which was in itself the most terrifying element of their arrival. The KKK detachment moved with a disconcerting, almost ritualistic discipline. They had settled into positions around the entire perimeter, forming an absolute ring of terror, their torches marking their individual positions at measured uniform intervals. They weren't rushing. They were basking in the profound, crushing dread their numbers created. This was psychological warfare before the physical assault, allowing the besieged family inside to fully comprehend the mathematical impossibility of their survival. "Isaiah," Clara whispered, her voice a thin, brittle thread barely audible above the relentless insect chorus. "The barn. They are taking positions near the hay." He nodded, his eyes never leaving the darkest quadrant of the yard where the main gate lay. "They are waiting for the signal, or perhaps for the sun to rise so they can watch us burn in daylight." He allowed himself one pattern interruption in the face of escalating dread, a fleeting thought of the arsenal. He walked silently to the corner of the room, pulling aside a worn rug to reveal a shallow, expertly concealed cache in the floorboards. He lifted out not just the Spencer repeater he had been handling, but 2 additional weapons, a heavy, reliable muzzle-loading shotgun filled with buckshot meant for bear, and his favorite and most familiar tool, the old, meticulously maintained military rifle from the war, a custom-built target rifle with an extended sight, capable of extraordinary precision at extreme range. The weapon he had used to earn the name The Hand. The realization hit him with cold clarity. They believed this was a simple, one-sided lynching. They saw the farm, the isolation, and the color of his skin, and concluded this was a routine exercise in intimidation and eventual murder. They had perhaps even dispatched a smaller force earlier that day to confirm the family's presence and their lack of immediate defensive structures. What the 100 hooded men surrounding the Holland farmstead did not, and could not comprehend, was that they had not surrounded a mere farmer clinging desperately to his freedom. They had surrounded an expert killer who had mastered his trade on the plantation owner's dime and the Confederacy's timeline. They had surrounded a man whose relationship with violence was not one of panic or desperation, but of calculated, cold execution. He loaded the custom rifle first, running a practiced finger over the smooth, oiled stock. The lead bullets in the pouch next to the rifle were heavy and polished. These were not generic rounds. These were hand-cast and weighed perfectly, tailored specifically to the subtle flaws of his barrel. Each one was a miniature testament to deadly accuracy. "They will expect a farmer to flee or to beg," Isaiah murmured, checking the percussion cap on the shotgun. They will not expect the devil they created to be waiting inside the walls they intend to break down. Clara moved closer, placing a steady hand on his shoulder. Her fear was palpable, but beneath it lay a resolute strength forged by years of shared struggle. "They are going to light the main barn, Isaiah. It will draw us out." "Let them," he said, the word cutting through the tense air like broken glass. He looked out again at the ring of fire and white cotton. The KKK was beginning to shift slightly, their preparation phase concluding. The psychological torment had run its course. It was time for the assault. The sheer mass of their number, the 100 spectral figures, should have crushed any hope. But for Isaiah, the numbers were not demoralizing. They were a target set, 100 targets. And he only needed to drop the first handful, the men carrying the torches and the most visible leaders, to transform the siege from an organized execution into a disorganized scramble of panic and confusion. He picked up the old custom-made target rifle, its familiar weight sinking comfortably into his shoulder, merging with his own skeletal structure as if it were an extension of his own will. The front sight settled easily onto the outline of the largest, most centrally positioned figure, clearly the leader, identifiable by his slightly more elaborate sheet and the steady, confident way he held his torch. The sun had now completely relinquished the sky, leaving the world an inky, suffocating blackness, broken only by the sickly flares of the clan's 100 torches. The perimeter was ready. The men were silent, poised for the signal. The silence, which had been so absolute, now felt like the drawn-back hammer of a massive, unstoppable firearm. The only thing separating Isaiah Holland from the fate intended for him and his family was the pull of a single trigger. He inhaled the stench of their assembly, calibrated the infinitesimal variables of the humid night air, and prepared to show the Ku Klux Klan precisely what sort of relic they had unearthed from the past. The 100 men were confident in their anonymity and their overwhelming force, but tonight their white robes wouldn't cloak their identities. They would serve only as luminous, inviting targets against the profound darkness of the Mississippi night. The prelude was over. The siege was about to begin, and the clan was about to discover that they had not merely surrounded a farm, they had stumbled into the killing grounds of a man honed to be the most terrifying weapon in the fractured South. If you are ready to hear the first deafening crack of the rifle shot that shattered the silence of the siege, proceed immediately to part 2. The night had congealed, thick and suffocating, wrapping the small, isolated homestead in a shroud spun from the cold sweat of fear and the heavy musk of 100 horses. The atmosphere was not silence. It was a profound, unnatural absence of sound where sound should be, the kind of stillness that precedes the rending of flesh. Beneath this imposed quietude, however, the earth transmitted vibrations, a low, incessant hum that rattled the loose window panes of the small cabin. It was the synchronized, agonizing breath of 100 men and their mounts, patient, terrible, and utterly surrounding. Inside the cabin, the sharpshooter, a man forged in the crucible of forced labor and refined in the brutal necessity of self-preservation, moved with the terrifying efficiency of a professional executioner preparing his tools. His world had shrunk to the 4 corners of this small fortified space, every window barricaded with reclaimed timber and iron scrap, every firing slot carefully positioned to maximize field of view while minimizing exposure. He wasn't calculating odds. The odds had calculated him long ago, finding him wanting, finding him doomed. He was simply calculating angles, trajectories, and the precise velocity required to rupture bone and extinguish life. The air in the cabin was heavy with the smell of gunpowder residue, lamp oil, and the faint coppery scent of fear that neither he nor his terrified wife and children could entirely suppress. They huddled in the root cellar beneath the main floor, a space dug deep into the stubborn Mississippi soil, listening to the man above them load and check his instruments of defense. This was not merely a dispute over land or a simple act of hatred. This was a statement, a foundational pillar of the emerging southern psyche, attempting to cement itself in blood. The nighthawks outside, cloaked in their grotesque, purifying white, saw in this singular man not just a former chattel, but a devastating contradiction. A black man who owned his land, maintained his dignity, and worst of all possessed a lethality that surpassed their own boasted, inherited militarism. He was the living, breathing proof that their system of racial and social hierarchy was a lie, And lies of that magnitude could only be purged by overwhelming, spectacular violence. The men outside had spent the last hour meticulously establishing their perimeter, a circle of pure malignancy drawn taut around the tiny ranch. They were not farmers with pitchforks. They were veterans of the late war, men who understood flanking maneuvers, cover, and the demoralizing power of a siege. Their initial plan had been simple: a rush, a fire, and a quick hanging, a ritualistic purging to remind the newly freed populations of their place. But the silence from the cabin was too measured, the defenses too intentional. The leader of the clan detachment, a man known only by the appellation Colonel Vex, though his actual rank was spurious and his hands permanently stained with nicotine and the residue of recent atrocities, held up a gloved hand. He knew the reputation of the man inside. Stories traveled faster than horses in the Reconstruction South. Tales of unnatural marksmanship, of a time before freedom, when this man had been utilized by his former master, not for field labor, but for eliminating Union scouts, or worse, silencing the troublesome voices of other enslaved men plotting revolt. He was a weapon built by the very system they sought to uphold, now turned against its architects. "He waits for us to make a mistake," Vex murmured to the lieutenant beside him, the moonlight glinting off the eye slits of the hood, making the face beneath look less like a man and more like a bleached skull. "He knows the dark better than we know the light. We give him no quarter, Lieutenant. We starve him out of his confidence first." The psychological warfare began not with a shot, but with a sound that clawed at the nerves, the methodical, rhythmic striking of axes against wood. They weren't felling trees. They were systematically dismantling the fence line, the barn, the outbuildings, anything that represented the sharpshooter's labor, his investment, his claim to prosperity. Each echoing thwack was a blow against the foundation of his liberty. The sharpshooter, positioned at a low aperture barely wider than his eye, watched the destruction of his world with a grim impassivity that belied the roaring terror in his chest. The outbuildings provided essential cover, and their removal meant the firing lanes were widening, exposing the cabin further. Yet, he held fire. His supply of ammunition was finite. The enemy's patience, unfortunately, seemed limitless. Every shot fired must be a life taken, not just a threat neutralized. He took a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of burnt wood and stale metal into his lungs. The weight of his rifle, a heavy, long-barreled percussion lock converted to use metallic cartridges, a prized, smuggled acquisition, felt like an extension of his own bone structure. He knew this weapon intimately. He had stripped it down hundreds of times, polished the bore until it shone like black glass, understood the infinitesimal drift of the bullet based on the humidity and the angle of the Earth's magnetic pull. It was a terrifying specialized knowledge, acquired not in the gentlemanly pursuit of sport, but in the brutal, necessary pursuit of survival. The first true act of malice came shortly after midnight. A group of 10 men, shielded by the darkness and the haphazard piles of lumber they had just created, began dragging something heavy toward the front porch. The sharpshooter didn't need to see it clearly to know what it was: kerosene and fire. "Papa," a small voice whispered from the darkness below, muffled by the dirt. His wife had crept up from the cellar, her face a mask of dried tears and fierce determination, standing just inside the trap door. "They'll burn the walls." He did not turn. His eye remained fixed to the brass bead sight. "They will try," he said, his voice a low, gravelly whisper that seemed to emanate not from his throat, but from the deep, strained core of the structure itself. "But they will not make it to the porch." He focused on the man carrying the heavy burlap sack that reeked of petrochemicals. The distance was approximately 70 yards, far beyond the effective range of most common rifles used by the KKK, but well within the zone of catastrophic injury for his specialized weapon. The man was moving fast, half-crouched, assuming the darkness was his shield. The sharpshooter exhaled completely, holding his breath until his chest felt tight and painful. The world narrowed to that single hooded shape, that fleeting moment of arrogance. He squeezed the trigger with the controlled, professional grace of a surgeon making an incision. The sound of the rifle blast, a deafening, concussive crack that seemed to rip a hole in the fabric of the silent night, was followed instantly by a sound infinitely worse: the wet, sickening impact of the round meeting bone. The man with the kerosene sack didn't scream. He simply collapsed, the force of the high-caliber round throwing him backward into the lumber pile he was using for cover. The sack burst, soaking the piled debris and several other riders in the flammable oil. Panic flashed across the field of vision for a brief electric moment. The other 9 men immediately dropped what they were doing and scurried back into the deeper shadows of the tree line, discarding the remaining fire materials. They had expected resistance, clumsy shots, wild fear. They had not expected clinical precision that nullified the darkness and the distance. Colonel Vex, positioned near the southern tree line, felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was the moment he had anticipated, the shift from ritualized terror to genuine mutual combat. The man inside was a ghost who had finally shown his hand, and that hand held death with terrifying certainty. "Return fire," Vex bellowed, his voice grating and sharp, cutting through the sudden silence that had followed the single shot. "Lay suppressing fire on the cabin. Do not advance. Pin him down." The response was immediate and devastating. 99 rifles erupted in a chaotic, deafening chorus. Old Springfield muzzle-loaders, Henry repeaters, and even a few repurposed Enfield muskets spewed a deluge of lead toward the cabin. The walls, though thick, shuddered violently. Bullets tore through the thinner sections, splintering wood and gouging deep furrows into the timber posts. The sharpshooter retreated instantly, dropping low and moving away from the firing slot, knowing that in the time it took the sound to reach the enemy, they would already be compensating for the muzzle flash. He crawled quickly to the center of the room, pulling his wife down next to him, shielding her with his body as wooden splinters rained down like jagged hail. "Stay here. Do not move," he commanded, his voice muffled by the noise. The sustained volley lasted perhaps 2 minutes, but in the claustrophobic confines of the besieged cabin, it felt like an eternity. The air filled with the sharp, acidic smell of black powder smoke, stinging the eyes and choking the breath. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the heavy rounds impacting the main logs was a drumming of inescapable doom. Then, as suddenly as it began, the firing stopped. The resulting silence was not the previous eerie quiet, but a charged, ringing cessation, heavy with the realization that the enemy was merely reloading. Vex wanted to see the man burn, but he recognized the immediate problem. If they rushed the house now, the sharpshooter, now known to be lethally accurate, would simply pick off their leaders in the open space. The cost of taking the cabin by direct assault would be too high, undermining the very image of their invincible authority they sought to project. "We hold the line," Vex hissed, his hood tilting toward the cabin. "We take turns firing, 2-man teams, maintaining the pressure. Send riders to the neighboring farms, cut off their retreat if they try to bolt into the cane fields, and find that damned slave dog's horses, shoot them, bleed them, leave them for the wolves. He will not escape this property." The siege had entered its second, more brutal phase. It was no longer about a quick display of power. It was about attrition, degradation, and the slow, methodical extraction of hope. The KKK understood that fear was a tool, but despair was a weapon of mass destruction. Back inside the cabin, the sharpshooter quickly assessed the damage. The front wall was pockmarked, deeply scored, but the main structural logs had held. He had purchased his land and built his house with a fierce independence, using the hardest oak he could find, logs soaked in preservative oil, a foresight that was now paying dividends in blood and time. He looked at the hole in the wall where he had fired, the small window of opportunity that had just claimed a life. His resolve hardened, but the terror for his family was a physical anchor dragging him down. He knew with dreadful certainty that if they broke through, his death would be the least of his family's suffering. He did not reload the long rifle yet. Instead, he pulled out a pair of heavy, custom-made pistols, Navy revolvers modified for faster reloading. These were for close work, for the interior defense should the inevitable breach occur. He placed them carefully on a nearby trunk within arm's reach. The waiting was the true torture, the insidious enemy that sought to dissolve the will. He had purchased this piece of earth with the sweat of his brow and the scars on his back, believing that the Emancipation Papers granted him not just freedom from a master, but freedom from fear. Now standing among the splintered wreckage of his peace, he knew the terrible, enduring truth. Freedom was not given. It had to be violently maintained, moment by grueling moment. He pressed his ear against the thick, smoke-stained timber. The night had absorbed the sounds of the gunfire, replacing it with the low, mocking cacophony of the 100 men circling. He could hear them talking now, low enough to be indistinguishable words, high enough to be perceived as laughter, cruel and distant. The game was simple. They wanted him to run out of patience, to rush out in a blaze of desperate glory, or to simply run out of ammunition. He would do neither. He was the anchor of this small, besieged island of liberty, and he knew something the men outside did not yet fully grasp. He hadn't just mastered the rifle. He had mastered the terrifying art of knowing precisely how much silence a man can bear before he breaks. He intended to let them find their limit first. He slipped a cartridge into the chamber of the rifle, the heavy click of the mechanism, a small, defiant note in the immense darkness. He was ready to wait for dawn, or for the next fool to try and approach his porch. But as the minutes stretched into a suffocating eternity, a new, far more immediate terror began to unfold outside the range of his rifle, the systematic killing of his livestock. The sickening thuds and panicked animal cries punctuated the night, each sound designed to remind him that the price of their patience was the steady destruction of everything he had built. They were dismantling his livelihood piece by piece, hoping to draw him out into the open, a move he knew he could not, must not, afford to make, no matter how deeply the cries of his dying animals cut through the night. The siege was just beginning, and the cost of every passing hour would be measured in things far more precious than wood or blood. The terror, palpable and pervasive, had simply changed its form, shifting from active violence to psychological demolition. The night belonged to the Nighthawks, and Silas knew his only chance was to make the coming day belong irrevocably to him. The absolute silence that followed the last, sputtering volley was not the peace of exhaustion, but the pressurized quiet of a contained explosion waiting for the final spark. It clung to the humid Mississippi night, heavy and foul, carrying the metallic scent of shed blood and the sharp, acidic tang of burnt powder. The 100 men arrayed in their sterile white vestments had ceased their reckless rush, their collective breathing turning shallow and ragged beneath the heavy cotton hoods. They had been stopped, not by a fortification manned by a company of soldiers, but by the unfathomable, relentless geometry of one man's aim. The realization, slow and sickening, had begun to infect the rank and file. They were not engaged in an act of punitive violence, but rather participating unwillingly in a highly personalized execution. They had come as judges and executioners, certain of the righteousness of their mob. Yet the only judgment being passed was on their own arrogance, delivered with surgical, terrifying precision. The casualty count, tallied in hushed whispers by the surviving lieutenants, was approaching the horrifying threshold that signaled not merely a setback, but a demoralizing rout. The sharpshooter, unseen, unheard beyond the roar of his rifle, had transformed the ranch clearing into an abattoir where the hunters were systematically culled. Every fallen hood represented a failure of their fundamental doctrine, that their mass, their color, and their perceived divine authority rendered them invulnerable to retribution from the man they deemed property. The tactical leader of the unit, a broad-shouldered man known only as the Grand Cyclops of that county, a farmer named Silas, who suddenly felt the weight of his inherited privilege buckle under the strain, scraped the damp soil with the toe of his boot, his terror manifesting as a rigid, vibrating fury. His initial plan, simple and barbaric, a direct, overwhelming charge intended to break the thin door and drag the man out for the ritual spectacle, had been irrevocably shredded by the first 15 minutes of defense. Now he faced a choice: retreat in humiliation, guaranteeing the collapse of local morale and the scrutiny of federal reconstruction authorities, or commit to a level of destruction that matched the savagery of their intent. The latter option was the only palatable path for the Klansmen. Their entitlement demanded a victory, regardless of the cost in their own diminishing ranks. The silence was broken by Silas's guttural command, the sound thick with phlegm and desperate malice. Torches, pitch, burn him out. This command initiated the siege's darkest chapter, transforming the conflict from a firefight to an architectural collapse. Detailed activity bloomed in the periphery. Men desperate to avoid the fatal trajectory of the main firing slits began to scavenge materials. Dry grass harvested from the edges of the field, bundled into thick, crackling sheaves. Tins of coal oil, kerosene, that had been brought for lamps and illumination, were now designated for spontaneous combustion. They found bundles of tarred rope intended for fence repair and lengths of pitch-soaked lumber from a collapsed shed, all of which were rapidly converted into crude, sputtering incendiaries. The preparation was conducted with an uneasy, frantic energy, a grim ballet of men trying to make loud, distracting noises to mask the deep, debilitating fear that the man inside might take offense at their preparations and send another messenger of death through the nearest window casing. Inside the fortified structure, the air was a thick chemical soup of smoke, sweat, and concentrated tension. The sharpshooter, his muscles coiled tight as old rope, his eyes perpetually scanning the narrow world framed by his defensive slits, knew the silence was a ruse, a necessary pause before the ultimate commitment. His heart pounded a low, heavy rhythm against his ribs, not with panic, but with the exertion of maintaining absolute stillness and the terrible weight of his loneliness. He had expended a frightening portion of his limited ammunition supply, trading heavy, irreplaceable lead for the brief reprieve he now enjoyed. He understood the architecture of siege warfare instinctively. If they couldn't breach the defenses, they would remove the structure entirely. He watched the flickering orange glow intensify through the peepholes, not merely handheld lanterns, but the purposeful, greedy light of large, constructed fires. The men were not aiming to set the roof alight, but to ignite the very foundation, to turn the earth floor into a slow oven and the wooden walls into a spontaneous pyre, driving him into the open, choking on the black smoke. A group of 4 men, moving with a desperate, unified swiftness born of Silas's immediate threat of reprisal, attempted the most terrifying maneuver yet. Carrying immense bundles of hay soaked in oil, they sprinted toward the northeast corner of the cabin, the most distant point from the main firing aperture, hoping the angle would grant them immunity. The sound of their heavy boots crunching on the gravel was a momentary eruption in the oppressive quiet. The sound of the rifle this time was different, not the clean, cracking retort of the long-range shots, but a sharp, brutal bark, muffled slightly by the interior air. The first man, burdened by the blazing bundle, crumpled instantly, the fire spilling harmlessly onto the wet earth. The shot had struck with the unmistakable efficiency of a practiced headshot, silencing the man before he registered the impact. The second man, galvanized by terror and the heat of the burning bundle now mere feet away, instinctively reversed his direction, sprinting back toward the tree line. The sharpshooter did not waste the next round on a fleeing target. He was conserving, calculating, but the third man, momentarily frozen between the immediate heat and the unseen threat, hesitated for a fatal second, confirming his existence as a stationary target. The second shot found its mark, shattering the silence and the man's momentum, sending him twisting into the darkness. The remaining 4th Klansman dropped his load and vanished back into the periphery, leaving the 2 corpses as gruesome monuments to their failed arson attempt. This precise, punitive response only fueled the Grand Cyclops' rage, solidifying the realization that the perimeter assault was utterly futile. They couldn't approach the walls. The field was zeroed. "The windows! The damn windows!" Silas roared, the frustration stripping away any veneer of military pretense. "Load the scatterguns! We make noise! We make confusion!" The next phase was a chaotic, demoralizing barrage. Shotguns, unsuitable for accuracy at this range, but devastating for noise and area denial, were loaded with birdshot and buckshot and aimed indiscriminately at the window openings, even those that had been heavily barricaded with logs and earth-filled sacks. The goal was purely psychological, an attempt to shatter the defender's focus, to fill the small space with wood splinters and flying debris, forcing him to keep his head down long enough for the actual destructive effort to commence. The roar of the shotgun fusillade was deafening, a jagged, tearing noise that contrasted sharply with the disciplined crack of the rifle. Inside, the noise was amplified to an unbearable pitch. Splinters screamed inward as the heavy pellets chewed through the outer layers of the reinforcement. Dirt and dust rained down from the ceiling joints. The sharpshooter pressed his face into the damp earth floor, the stock of his rifle held tight, enduring the temporary storm. He knew the difference between nuisance fire and lethal assault. This was noise, nothing more, a desperate act by men who knew they were losing the psychological war. As the shotgun blast subsided, replaced by the ringing in the ears of both attacker and defender, the decisive maneuver began. Silas had ordered 2 enormous bundles of dry, kerosene-soaked brush, each the size of a hay bale, to be rolled rather than carried toward the sides of the house, propelled by long, thick poles wielded by men prone in the dirt. This offered a degree of protection, minimizing the exposed body area, It was slow, agonizing work, requiring coordinated pushes under the watchful, unseen eye of the man inside. The first bale reached the western wall. In the sickly moonlight, the clansmen struck match after match, their gloved hands shaking until the oil-soaked material caught with a whooshing roar, sending a column of black, oily smoke spiraling toward the stars. The heat was immediate, radiating outward and driving the clansmen back. But they had accomplished their primary task. The fire was pressed tight against the heavy, dry wood of the cabin. The sharpshooter heard the ominous crackle and registered the rapid temperature spike on the western flank. Time had run out. This was the threat he could not shoot down, the enemy he could not conserve ammunition against. He knew the specific vulnerabilities of his own construction. The outer logs were heavy and thick, but the inner chinking and the dry air within would turn the structure into a chimney once the fire truly took hold. He did not rush. His movements were the practiced economy of a man accustomed to life-or-death decision-making. He moved away from the western wall toward the north-facing root cellar access built into the corner of the floor. This was his contingency, a carefully planned exit and secondary defense. The root cellar, lined with stones and accessible through a heavy, trap door secured by a thick wooden bolt, was his last sanctuary. It led to a short, cramped tunnel, initially dug for storage during the lean winter months, which terminated at the exterior, underneath the old, stone-lined well house. This final exit point, disguised by years of sediment and dry leaves, was the key to his survival, the ultimate hidden loop. With the heavy scent of burning pine and pitch already beginning to sting his nostrils, he dropped to his knees, his rifle held securely across his back. He wrestled with the heavy wooden bolt, the sound of the scraping metal lost in the increasing roar of the fire outside. The bolt slid back, and he pulled the heavy trapdoor inward, revealing a gap of profound cold darkness, smelling of damp earth and mold. As he slid down into the cellar, careful not to disturb the few remaining crates of dried goods, the first visible tongue of flame licked through a narrow gap in the western wall, instantly vaporizing the air within and sending thick, poisonous smoke rolling toward the ceiling. He pulled the trapdoor shut over his head, sinking the heavy bolt back into place, securing himself inside his subterranean refuge, just as the main structure truly began its agonizing, fiery surrender. Outside, the clansmen cheered, a ragged, triumphant roar that was quickly muffled by the overwhelming sound of the inferno. The entire western side of the cabin was now engulfed, flames leaping 10 feet high, painting the surrounding trees in a horrific dancing orange light. Silas, standing a safe distance away, felt a rush of vindication wash over the fear he had been battling. They had prevailed. They had contained the threat, reduced the man to ashes, proving that their collective will was indeed superior. The horror was dissipating, replaced by the righteous satisfaction of destruction. "Hold the perimeter!" Silas bellowed through the smoke, his voice raw. "He's finished. We wait for the walls to fall, then we search the embers." The men settled into a wide semicircle, watching the bonfire of the sharpshooter's home. The heat was unbearable, the smoke thick and choking, but they watched, transfixed by the spectacle of their victory. They waited for the distinct sound of the roof beam snapping, the final groan of the structure collapsing, confirming the end of the resistance. But even as the main structure roared, a sound far more subtle, far more chilling, cut through the noise of the blaze. It was the distinct, sharp and terrifyingly unmuffled crack of a rifle shot. It came not from the burning structure, which was now a furnace, nor from the fields behind them, but from a location they had entirely discounted, the small, dilapidated well house positioned 30 yards to the north. A clansman standing near the well house perimeter, distracted by the overwhelming heat, suddenly stumbled and dropped, a clean, swift hole appearing just below his hoodline. The shot was low, clear, and perfectly aimed, demonstrating that the terror had merely moved locations. Silas froze, the temporary warmth of victory curdling in his stomach. The man was not dead. He had not burned. He had burrowed, moving through the very earth they walked upon, and now he had reappeared, fresh, renewed, and absolutely determined. The sharpshooter was not a caged beast to be smoked out. He was a viper that had merely shed its skin, relocating the fight to an entirely new, deeply psychological plane. The siege was not over. It had just descended into the claustrophobic horror of the unknown. The burning house was merely a distraction. The real battle was about to begin, fought in the deep shadows and the rising smoke, where the man of the land knew every stone and root, and the attackers were entirely irrevocably blind. The terror had just begun its second, more insidious cycle. The fire raged, but the fighting had retreated into the earth, setting the stage for the final desperate confrontation that would determine whether the sharpshooter would emerge from the darkness to greet the dawn or be buried beneath the ashes of his own defense. The well house, silent except for the trickle of groundwater, had become the epicenter of a new kind of dread, one where the enemy was utterly invisible and the white hoods offered no protection at all. How long could he sustain this subterranean defense? What ammunition remained in his reserves? And crucially, how many more lives were the clansmen willing to sacrifice before their thirst for vengeance finally turned into a desperate, shameful flight? The answers were buried deep in the earth, waiting to explode into the final act of the siege. The dawn was a malignant, sluggish thing, promising no redemption, only the horrific clarity of light exposing the night's carnage. The air, thick as clotted blood, offered a nauseating cocktail of scorched earth, gunpowder residue, wet pine needles, and the iron tang of fresh human slaughter. Silence, deep and unforgiving, had finally replaced the cacophony of the siege, a silence heavier than any thunder, broken only by the ragged, painful inhalations of the survivors. Elijah stood amidst the wreckage, a skeletal sentinel silhouetted against the nascent, polluted light. His clothes were fused to his skin by sweat and grime, and the weight of the last 4 days had etched itself into the very structure of his face, making him look ancient, carved from exhausted stone. His rifle, the extension of his legendary wrath, rested against the shattered remains of the porch rail, its barrel smoking faintly, a residual testament to the fury it had unleashed. The final surge of the clan had been desperate, barbaric, and utterly reckless. When the last of Elijah's conventional ammunition, the carefully molded perfect-bore bullets, had been expended, the 100+ remaining attackers, fueled by fanatical rage and the realization that their dominance was slipping, had launched a coordinated assault, believing the sharpshooter's supernatural protection had finally been exhausted. They came in a tight, unholy formation, ignoring the scattered shots from the few remaining allies inside, relying on sheer mass and the primitive momentum of the mob. Elijah had known this moment was inevitable. He had always saved the worst for last, not out of strategic prudence, but out of a deep-seated, horrific need to make the final lesson indelible. He had reserved a small, meticulously crafted cache of personalized ordnance: scrap iron, shards of thick glass, hardened buckshot mixed with gravel, and most damningly, bullets filed down to jagged, asymmetrical points designed not for clean killing, but for maximum tearing, maximum agony, and the absolute destruction of morale. As the mob surged toward the inner wall, the makeshift palisade that had held for 3 nights, Serafina, her face smeared with soot and tears, her hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion, fed the specialized cartridges into the breech of the rifle. The sound was deafeningly close now, the heavy rhythmic thud of a felled log used as an improvised battering ram, striking the inner barricade. The wood splintered with a groaning shriek, and a sliver of the terrifying white-robed mass became visible through the rent. Elijah did not aim for the center mass. He did not aim for the head. He focused on the joints, the knees, the hips, the shoulders, using the jagged projectiles to turn bone to powder and muscle to shredded filament, ensuring that the men who fell did so screaming, convulsing in grotesque, unstoppable pain, thereby tripping and demoralizing the ranks behind them. It was a calculated performance of theatrical dread, designed to transmute their racist confidence into primordial, panic-stricken fear. The clan's leader, the self-appointed Colonel Silas, a brute whose voice had boomed orders and hateful rhetoric throughout the siege, finally broke through the gap, his eyes wild, his hood torn, revealing a face contorted by disbelief and a consuming, murderous entitlement. He carried a heavy hunting axe, slick with the gore of a fallen ally, and screamed a promise of slow, agonizing retribution upon Elijah's family. This was the climax. The great, horrific revelation of the siege was not that Elijah could shoot straight, but that he possessed the cold, necessary resolve to become a monster, tailored precisely to counteract their own. Elijah ignored the peripheral chaos, the desperate close-quarters struggle of his few allies against the stream of invaders pouring through the broken gate. He saw only Silas, the embodiment of the system that had stolen his life, tortured his people, and now sought to erase his existence. The rifle spat fire one last time, an ear-splitting concussion that drowned out all other sound. This final round was not jagged iron or glass. It was a pure, solid lead projectile, but it had been wrapped in a thin layer of waxed thread, calibrated specifically to ensure maximum impact disruption. Silas lunged, axe raised, believing he had crossed the threshold of protection. The bullet struck him not in the chest, but precisely at the point where the breastbone meets the clavicle, tearing away the top portion of his sternum and scrambling the pathways of his central nervous system in a flash of incandescent, lethal efficiency. Colonel Silas did not fall immediately. The massive body stood upright for a terrible, eternal second, the momentum of his charge carrying him forward 3 paces, his eyes staring blankly at the dark muzzle of the rifle. Then the weight of the moment, the finality of the defeat caught up. He collapsed forward, not with a simple thud, but with a sickening, liquid sound, the heavy axe clattering uselessly beside him. The death of Silas was the pattern interrupt the clan could not recover from. They had been taught that their leaders were chosen, blessed by some divine right of white supremacy. Seeing their brutal commander annihilated not by an ambush or a battle line, but by a lone figure who seemed capable of bending the very laws of physics to his will, shattered the fragile cohesion of the mob. The remaining 40 or so attackers, who had been surging forward with bloodlust, froze. They looked at the slumped, grotesque figure of Silas, at the dozen or more men writhing on the ground in unstoppable agony from the customized ordnance, and then up at the dark, impassive figure of Elijah. The narrative flipped instantly. They were no longer the avenging force, they were the prey. A guttural, panicked cry erupted from the center of the crowd, a sound not of defiance, but of pure, absolute terror. Then came the rout. It was chaotic, clumsy, and definitive. Men stumbled over the dead, clawed at each other, desperate to escape the immediate, terrible radius of Elijah's weapon. Robes snagged on the remnants of the barricade. Horses, tethered further back, whinnied and bolted, scattering the retreat. The survivors did not look back. They ran from the farm through the scarred fields, carrying the knowledge that they had faced something inhuman, something that exceeded the boundaries of their hateful cosmology. They ran not because they were defeated in battle, but because they were broken by fear, a fear Elijah had manufactured and wielded with the same precision as his rifle. When the last frantic echo of their retreat died away into the humid distance, an awful quiet descended. The sun, finally rising above the tree line, did not bring warmth, only a harsh, inescapable light that painted the scene in brutal relief. The ranch was a charnel house. Dozens of white-robed figures lay scattered across the yard, tangled among the broken fences and pulverized earth. The sheer scale of the massacre was difficult to comprehend. It was not a skirmish, but an extermination, localized and absolute. The specialized rounds had done their work with horrific efficiency, leaving trails of crimson across the dew-wet grass, marking the paths of the agonizing retreat. The air was thick with the stench of death, a palpable, oppressive weight that pressed down on the few survivors. Elijah lowered the rifle, the heavy object feeling suddenly feather-light in his hands. He leaned his head against the splintered wood, his entire body convulsing in a silent, violent fit of exhaustion. He hadn't slept more than scattered minutes in 4 days. He hadn't just defended his home. He had poured every ounce of his accumulated suffering, every memory of the lash, every piece of suppressed rage into the muzzle of his gun. Serafina rushed to him, checking him for wounds, her hands frantically tracing the contours of his body. He was physically intact, spared by his foresight and skill, but internally ravaged. The light in his eyes, always burning with a focused intensity, seemed dimmer, eclipsed by the sheer darkness he had navigated. "They're gone, Elijah," she whispered, her voice cracking, the magnitude of the relief too massive to articulate. "They're gone. We won." Elijah only nodded, the simple movement requiring monumental effort. Winning, he knew, was a relative term. They survived the siege, but the cost was staggering. The farm, the sanctuary they had painstakingly built since emancipation, was irreparably ruined. The crops were trampled, the outbuildings were scorched, and the house itself, though standing, was peppered with bullet holes and structural damage. More importantly, the geopolitical reality of their situation had been irrevocably altered. This victory was too grand, too definitive, too terrifying to be absorbed quietly by the surrounding counties. 100 men, the organized instrument of white terror, had been annihilated or scattered by a single black family and their handful of allies. This was not merely resistance, it was an act of open rebellion, a declaration of sovereign territory defined by the range of Elijah's rifle. The open loops were closed, but they revealed a terrifying truth. They had won the battle, but secured a life sentence of perpetual flight. Federal troops had never arrived. The promise of distant justice proved hollow, confirming Elijah's initial cynical assessment that true protection would only come from the cold steel of his own weapon. The siege was over, but the war for Elijah and Seraphina had just entered its mobile, desperate phase. As the sun climbed higher, illuminating the scene in agonizing clarity, the small group of survivors began the grim, necessary work of recovery. First, checking the living, tending to the injured, then surveying the silent, white-robed multitude that littered their yard. They had to be moved, removed, hidden. The evidence of this unprecedented act of self-liberation had to be contained, or the retaliation would come not from a disorganized mob, but from state militia or the mobilized wrath of the entire region. Elijah stood over the body of Silas, recognizing the face of the hate that had pursued him across the entire stretch of his miserable youth. There was no triumph, only a weary resignation. Killing was necessary, but it provided no solace, only the confirmation of the harsh, unforgiving world they inhabited. The conclusive realization hammered home. Their home was gone. They could not remain here. The legend of the black sharpshooter who defended his ranch against the KKK would spread like wildfire, twisting and growing in the telling until Elijah became a mythical figure of terror and a primary target for every vengeful soul south of the Ohio River. They had purchased their freedom with blood, but the currency demanded immediate relocation. By midday, after salvaging what little food and ammunition remained, and after burying the dead of their own small group in silent, hasty graves behind the house, Elijah prepared their wagon. The siege had ended not with peace, but with the necessary urgency of flight. They had to vanish into the vast, indifferent landscape of Reconstruction America, carrying the horrific secret of the carnage they had wrought. Seraphina took one final look at the scarred, blood-drenched ranch, the place they had called home, now ruined, eternally marked by the ghosts of the night. She did not cry. The terror had calcified into a brittle, desperate strength. She placed her hand on Elijah's arm, feeling the taut muscle beneath the grimy fabric. "Where to, Elijah?" she asked, the question not about direction but about their future, a future defined by constant vigilance. Elijah looked west, toward the territories, toward the promise of anonymity that the growing nation offered. He hefted his rifle, checking the remaining powder, and led one last time. "Away from the silence," he stated, his voice a dry, rasping whisper, "where the victory doesn't smell like burning men." The wagon pulled away, leaving the silent, blood-soaked ranch behind. The sun shone mercilessly on the wreckage, exposing the definitive end of the siege and the terrifying beginning of their unending journey. They were free, purchased by the incredible, unforgettable violence of a legendary sharpshooter, but they were forever haunted, the living, breathing monument to a historical act of resistance too profound, too bloody, and too threatening to the established order to ever be safely recorded in the official histories of Mississippi 1871. The ranch siege was a massacre, covered by the silence of fear, a necessary horror whose truth was carried only in the weary eyes of the survivors who rode away into the relentless uncertainty of the American West. If you've made it this far, you're one of us. Subscribe, like, and tell me in the comments what state you live in. We want to build an American community of listeners. The legacy of Elijah was sealed. He was the man who made the Klan retreat in terror, the architect of a slaughter that preserved a family's freedom. His name would pass into whispers among the oppressed, a ghost story for the oppressors, a terrifying reminder that even in the deepest heart of the racist darkness there existed a point of light, defined and defended by cold, precise lead. The silence remained, the only witness to the hundreds of lives altered or ended in that tiny, blood-drenched corner of Mississippi. A terrifying payoff to 4 days of unwavering, impossible resistance. The price of their absolute freedom was absolute rootlessness, paid in the currency of the dead.